Hi there, this is Mike Gidding from Third Eye Geoscience. I teach a training course on seismic interpretation, and recently the people at Schlumberger offered to run the Delfi machine learning for fault interpretation over one of the teaching datasets that I use. So today I wanted to have a quick look at the results of that and share my thoughts. So this is the dataset that we're talking about. You can see that it's a set of extensional faults underneath a big unconformity. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and the easiest way to show that is to actually turn on my old fault framework that I've done manually. There it is there. As you move back and forth, you can see that some of these faults, like this one for example, tends to travel across the dataset, and the reason for that, if we turn off the blue button, is because there is a set of orthogonal faults that have occurred post unconformity, which propagate down through the pre-unconformity sediments. So it's not super simple, but it's a pretty good data set, apart from it being a little bit ringy, so a bit narrow bandwidth. It's a pretty good data set, and you would expect that the machine learning tools wouldn't have too much trouble. So let's see the results. Turn those off, and I will turn on the user-trained fault prediction results. It's popped up behind, so we'll grab that and push it to the front. And this is what you get. You get a seismic volume that looks something like this. And it's not much use on its own because you can't really compare it to the seismic, so let's use the mixer and we'll create another volume that way. So now we can see the mixer has shown us our reflectivity volume and the results of the machine learning fault detection. Now this uses an image recognition technique similar to what we would use for face recognition or number plate recognition, that sort of stuff. So it's not using any wavelet cross-correlation algorithm or any of those things anymore. And you can see it's done a pretty magnificent job in a lot of places. The other thing that the Delfi product does is it actually takes these discontinuities, for want of a better word, and it converts them into a structural framework. So let's have a look at the result of that. Turn our blue button back on, go back to our models, and turn on the machine learning structural framework. And it's done a pretty good job of translating those discontinuities into a set of faults. And on a line-by-line basis, they look pretty good. Let's have a bit of a look at the result when we turn off the blue button and look at the whole thing. And this is where our first problems arise. Not big problems, but problems nonetheless. Here, for example, you can see that one of the younger faults has terminated one of the older faults. Now that can't really happen. So the very least that you would want to be doing in here is going and looking at your fault intersections in your structural framework. You can see that's happened more than once. And here's an old fault terminating a young fault. That can't really happen either. Again, here, you can see these faults probably should be the same fault. So there's a few cases like that which need a little bit more work. The other thing I want to do is I want to compare the results of the machine learning with my structural framework that you saw at the beginning of the video. So let's turn that off, turn the blue button back on, and now you see why my structural framework was black before, so that we could compare it with the results of the machine learning. And now you can start to see that there are a few inconsistencies between the two. In some places, it's like here, for example, it's done a pretty good job over most of each of the faults. The yellow fault's great, the pink fault's great, the purple fault in here is great, the blue fault's pretty good until you get near the bottom. But there are a lot of places where there are two faults and it's only picked one. and places where faults don't go as far as they should or go too far. So the results are what I would consider to be outstanding compared to anything you would get out of AntTrack, but the results are not a final product. At another area where we might see some differences. If we come to the southern end, we have an hourglass forming. You can see here that we've got again the same problem where there are actually two faults, but the machine learning has condensed that to one. These are the sort of things that you want to be checking when you go through and QC one of these machine learning volumes. It's to make sure that the interpretation that you would have put in is consistent with what you are seeing. And in this case, this needs quite a bit more work. So there are three options when it comes to what we do next with our data in terms of creating a new fault framework or a modified fault framework based on what we have. The first one we already briefly discussed, which is just go in and edit the fault relationships. That could take a few minutes to an hour, depending on how big the data set is, maybe a few hours. If it's a really big data set, maybe a few days. The second alternative would be to go and take the existing framework that's been generated through the machine learning process. It generates fault patches, which turn into point sets, which then turn into the structural model. I won't go into the details of that because I don't understand them completely because I've had this run for me. But then we've got a set of structural framework faults, which we need to get back into some sort of fault interpretation that we can edit. So how do we do that? So let's tidy up a little bit first. I will turn off my fault framework and turn the blue button off for the moment. And the steps involved in that, there's about 4 steps to get from a structural framework back to a set of fault sticks. Now these are useful not just for this exercise, but they're also useful if you decide to build your structural framework before you do your horizon interpretation. Then my recommendation on a good course of action is to convert your structural framework back to a set of fault sticks and use that fault interpretation for your auto tracking, because then you will have no discrepancy between your structural framework faults and your interpretation, which means that you won't have bits hanging on the wrong side of faults when you go to build your horizon model. If that doesn't make a lot of sense, then you probably haven't built a VBM. Okay, so let's have a go through those steps. So the first step here is we take our structural modeling tool and we hit this button up here called SF to fault model. Okay, and so we can call this whatever we want. We can call this the ML export, and we can choose the faults to input. We can go down and to our machine learning framework and put those in there. When we do that, we can go to the settings, choose the shape of the faults and the pillar spacing, and then we can hit OK. And this is what we get. We get a bunch of things which aren't fault interpretation yet. They are something called fault sticks. If you're unfamiliar with this, they are sitting in the model still. Right, and so then we have to convert those to sticks, and they will now sit in the interpretation window there, and then we right click again and we convert to fault interpretation. And so now we will have a new interpretation subfolder in our interpretation folder called fault sticks from fault model. And if we turn these guys all off, they're down in the model here, and turn these fault sticks on, there are our fault sticks. And they need to be checked one at a time because occasionally they go a bit haywire. So That's pretty easy to do. I'll show you an example maybe. I'll turn that one on. And let's go through and check each one. That looked pretty good actually. That looked really good in fact. Occasionally we get a bad one, but not in this case. Okay, so from here you can go and reinterpret with these fault sticks. We might need to turn our X line back on. Shift R. And if we now turn on our blue button, turn off the framework, turn on our faults. Oh, blue button's on, sorry. Okay, all the people that have done my course will be laughing at that because I always catch people out with the blue button on and wondering why restrict mode doesn't work. So here is our fault interpretation based on the machine learning, and we could go away and edit that to our satisfaction. The other thing we can do is start again and build our fault interpretation in a conventional way, but with the power of the existing structural framework generated by the machine learning and the seismic volume itself as an augmentation to our interpretation volume. So let's have a look at how we set that up. I would normally do this in what I call tandem windows, which is two windows that behave the same way but have different content. So we're going to have to reorganize a little bit for that. So we'll start by clearing that one up. And we're going to turn on our normal reflectivity. There it is, but we actually don't want the blue button on, and we don't want. So here's our reflectivity. We probably want opacity on. And now we want to make a copy of that. So we will clone the window and we will move that clone to the previous tab group. And let's even those up a little bit. Something like that. No, not quite. Getting close. Yeah. And we'll turn the camera link on so that they're behaving the same way. And now we want to populate one of them with the machine learning information. Now it's not so simple, because if we put the machine learning stuff in instead, if we go to here and we choose the user trained, that's not telling us an awful lot. So what I've gone and done is I've gone and generated, using the calculator, and the expression that's shown up here, which is a simple Boolean expression saying, show me the reflectivity data everywhere except where it's orange or yellow. You can see that through there. I might put that formula in the comments as well, just in case there's anyone that's unfamiliar with how to set that up. And instead of the export from the machine learning, we're going to use that merged reflectivity. So now you can see the location of all of the machine learning faults. They're not necessarily in the right location, but they're a good guide. And you could even go so far as to turn on your blue button here and turn on your fault framework from the machine learning. And that gives you an even better guide as to what's going on. Now you can carry on with your interpretation in the left-hand view as you would normally, using whatever tools and processes you normally do. People that have done the course have a system that I've provided them that they're pretty happy with, but I won't go into that now. Okay, so in summary, there are a few things that I'd like to conclude with. Firstly, machine learning does a much better job than ant tracking. That should be pretty obvious to everybody. Ant tracking has a lot of artifacts and has been horribly misused by people that over-interpret those volumes over the years. So I'm glad we're moving away from ant tracking in some respects. Great tool, but open to a lot of abuse. The second thing is the structural framework shows a good extraction success ratio for the fault patches extricated from the machine learning prediction volume. The third thing is that the results are not good enough to move forward without at least careful review and most likely some reinterpretation. Got to be very careful about using these things straight off the press and straight through to horizon interpretation, because clearly some of the smaller faults, particularly when there's two faults close together, aren't being captured by this image recognition process. Fourthly, and one of the things I don't think many people thought about when they started figuring out how to output this result, is that it gets people into the structural framework and volume-based modelling, which I'm really excited about. There are a lot of people out there that don't have a good understanding of volume-based modelling, and this will at least be an introduction to the tools, and hopefully it will get people using the tool in a much more efficient manner. And finally, I'm told that this is not the end for machine learning for fault interpretation, and that Schlumberger have new things coming out imminently in terms of azimuthal guidance and things like that. So this video may not be current for very long. It could be that within 6 months to a year, some of the tools in here will be dramatically improved. It may be that you'll be able to export fault sticks directly. Otherwise, you can carry on with the method that I've shown. It generates a lot of intermediate steps, but they're all deletable. And so you can generate your fault sticks pretty quickly and get back into modifying that interpretation to get it just the way you want to. So I hope that's been helpful, and I look forward to hearing from anybody that's got any extra comments on their experiences with machine learning, or if you need to get in touch with regards to training or consulting, please get in touch via my website. Thanks a lot.